What happens when a war that felt 1,000 kilometers away suddenly lands on your own roof in the middle of the night while you're fast asleep? For one Russian city, that question stopped being hypothetical on the morning of August 10th, 2026. Before we go any further, if you want more videos that cut through the noise and explain this war in a way that actually makes sense, tap subscribe right now, hit that like button so this reaches more people, and send this to one friend who still thinks this conflict is stuck in a stalemate. It isn't. Stay with me, because what happened this one night quietly changes the shape of the entire picture. There is a city called Nizhnekamsk, sitting deep inside Russia, in the region of Tatarstan. Most people outside Russia had never heard its name before this night, and honestly, most people inside Russia had barely thought about it either. It is not close to any border. It is not close to any front line. It sits more than 1,100 kilometers from Ukraine, farther east than Moscow itself, tucked into a part of the country that has spent almost 4 years quietly believing it was untouchable. For the people who live there, this war has always been something that happened on a screen, something you read about over breakfast, something you saw in a news clip late at night before switching the channel, something that happened to other people in other cities on the other side of an enormous country, not something that happened directly above your own street while you were asleep in your own bed. That changed just after sunrise. Air raid sirens broke the morning quiet, the kind of sound that residents there had heard about but rarely, if ever, heard for themselves. Then came the low buzzing sound of small engines, the kind of sound that does not belong in a peaceful sky over a peaceful industrial town. Then came the fire. Thick black smoke began climbing above one of the largest and most advanced oil refineries in the entire country, visible for miles in every direction. By mid-morning, the story was already spreading across the world. Ukraine had struck deep inside Russian territory, more than 1,000 kilometers from its own border, and hit one of the most important fuel processing hubs in the nation. It was also, by most measures, one of the most lethal strikes on Russian soil in months. That part matters, and it deserves to be said clearly before anything else. Local authorities in Tatarstan reported that at least 13 people were killed. Among them was a child. Dozens more were wounded, some seriously. Drones hit both industrial buildings, and civilian ones scattered across the city. According to reporting, a hostel was among the structures damaged that morning. This was not a clean, surgical hit on an empty industrial site far away from anyone. This was not the kind of tidy, sanitized strike you see described in a press release. People died in a city more than 1,100 kilometers from a front line they genuinely believed they were safe from. That is the human cost, and it should never be treated as a footnote buried underneath the bigger strategic story. Behind every casualty number is a family, a home, a mourning that started like any other and ended in grief. But underneath that tragedy sits a much bigger story, one that says a great deal about where this war is heading next, and one that Moscow does not have an easy answer for. Nizhnekamsk was not an isolated event. It was one single, terrible point of light inside something far larger. One of the biggest coordinated drone operations of the entire war took place that same night, and it stretched across the whole map of Russia, from one edge to the other. To understand why this one night matters so much, you have to understand how this war has quietly changed shape over the last 2 years. For a long time, this conflict looked mostly like a war of trenches, artillery duels, and slow, grinding movements along a fixed front line that barely shifted for months at a time. That is the version most people picture when they think about this war. Mud, trenches, and a line on a map that hardly moves. But there has always been a second war happening at the same time, quieter, less visible, and far less understood by casual observers. A war fought not with soldiers crawling through fields, but with cheap, mass-produced flying machines crossing hundreds and now thousands of kilometers to hit targets that soldiers on the ground could never reach. That second war has been growing steadily, month after month, largely outside the spotlight. August 10th is the moment that second war finally became impossible to ignore. Let's clear up a number you're going to see everywhere online, because it is extremely easy to misunderstand, and a lot of headlines are going to get it wrong on purpose because the wrong version sounds more dramatic. You will see the figure 456 drones, and headlines will make it sound like a single massive swarm descending on one target all at once, like something out of a movie. That is not actually what happened, and I'm not going to feed you an exaggerated version of events just because it sounds more exciting. That number comes directly from Russia's own Ministry of Defense. It is not a count of drones that were launched by Ukraine. It is a claim about interceptions, the total number Russia says its own air defenses managed to shoot down over the course of one night. And that number was spread across roughly 15 to 17 different regions of the country, plus occupied Crimea. The official statement never says how many drones actually got through those defenses, but sit with the honest version of that claim for just a moment, because it is arguably far more unsettling than the exaggerated myth everyone is sharing online. Russia is essentially admitting, in its own official statement that in a single night, it had to defend against Ukrainian drones across more than 15 separate regions at the exact same time. From areas right along the border with Ukraine to the outskirts of Moscow itself to Tatarstan, 1,000 kilometers deep into the country's interior. This was not one arrow flying toward one target. This was a storm, scattered across a landmass so enormous it spans multiple time zones. That is the real story hiding quietly inside that headline number. Not one giant swarm hitting one place, but an entire country forced to respond at once everywhere, all through the night, with no way to know where the next track would appear. If you're finding this useful so far, do me a quick favor. Drop a comment telling me which part of this story surprised you the most. It genuinely helps this video reach more people who want to understand what is actually happening in this war, instead of just reacting to a scary headline someone else wrote in 5 minutes. Here's the part that turns a simple number into something closer to an actual weapon. Not every drone included in that count was even carrying a warhead. Ukraine's long-range strike units have openly admitted in public statements that they deliberately mix decoys into these raids. Some drones are empty shells, built only to look threatening on a radar screen. Others carry real explosives capable of causing serious damage. On a radar screen, at night, moving at speed, they look almost identical. Defenders have no reliable way to tell the difference in the exact moment it matters most. So Russian air defense crews are forced to react to every single track that appears on their screens because they simply cannot afford to guess wrong. Crews scramble out of bed in the middle of the night. Interceptor missiles burn through expensive fuel. Radar systems light up across entire regions, sometimes just to shoot down a piece of foam and plywood pretending to be a real threat worth millions of dollars to intercept. That is the trap hidden quietly inside a swarm attack like this one. The more drones you send, even cheap and completely unarmed ones, the more you force the enemy's limited and expensive defenses into the air at the same time. And the more real, armed weapons slip through undetected, hidden behind all that noise and confusion. Think about it from the defender's point of view for a second. Every single blip has to be treated as a real threat until proven otherwise, because the one time you assume it is fake, it might be the one carrying the warhead. That psychological pressure, spread across an entire country, night after night, adds up in ways that are hard to measure but impossible to ignore. Go back just 2 or 3 years, and this entire picture would have sounded almost impossible. In the early stages of this war, most strikes launched from Ukrainian territory stayed relatively close to the border, limited by range, by available technology, and by simple production capacity. A drone reaching a few hundred kilometers into Russian territory was considered a major event, worth days of coverage on its own. Now, a strike traveling more than 1,000 kilometers barely holds the news cycle for a single afternoon before the next one arrives to replace it. That shift did not happen by accident, and it did not happen overnight either. It happened through years of quiet engineering work, trial and error, and a wartime industrial effort that most outside observers never got to see up close until the results started showing up on the map. That is the part of this story that deserves real attention, even more than the smoke and the headlines. A country under invasion, fighting for its survival on the ground, still found the resources, the engineers, and the industrial capacity to build an entirely new class of weapon almost from scratch, and then scale its production fast enough to change the basic math of this war within a matter of months. Now think carefully about where the deepest blow actually landed that night, because that specific location is exactly what makes this such a serious problem for Russia going forward. Nizhnekamsk is not some random forgettable town lost somewhere on a map. It is one of the true crown jewels of the entire Russian oil economy, a name that matters enormously to anyone who understands how this war is actually being funded. The city is home to a massive refinery complex operated by Tatneft, one of the largest and most technologically advanced refineries anywhere in the entire country, processing a reported 16 million tons of crude oil every single year. Ukraine's military command confirmed publicly that its forces struck that refinery directly and set part of it on fire. Tatarstan had actually been touched by this war once before, though far more lightly. A smaller strike hit the same complex back in 2024, causing limited damage and barely making international headlines. But for most of this war, this deep interior region felt genuinely insulated from everything happening hundreds of kilometers away, protected almost entirely by sheer distance and geography. This time, the strike arrived as part of a coordinated nationwide operation with far more scale, far more precision, and far more intent behind it than anything attempted before. So why does a refinery, sitting more than 1,100 kilometers away from the actual fighting matter, enough for Ukraine to reach all that way just to hit it? The answer comes down to something simple but absolutely critical. Refineries are not just industrial buildings sitting quietly on the landscape. They turn raw crude oil into the diesel and gasoline that keep Russian tanks moving across battlefields, trucks rolling along supply lines, and jets flying overhead. They also produce the fuel exports that help finance an enormous share of the entire invasion, generating the revenue that pays for missiles, salaries, and replacement equipment. That is the campaign Ukraine has been running hard and consistently throughout 2026, strike after strike, week after week. Hit the refineries, choke the fuel supply at its source, starve the war machine of both the fuel it needs to move and the money it needs to keep replacing what it loses on the battlefield. We still do not know the full extent of the lasting damage done to this particular refinery, and it will likely take weeks before a complete picture emerges. Ukraine reported a significant fire, and a full assessment will take time to confirm. But here's the part genuinely worth sitting with for a moment. The physical reach that carried the single strike all the way there simply did not exist a couple of years ago. Ukraine built that capability almost entirely from nothing under wartime pressure, using resources that were nowhere near as advanced when this invasion first began back in 2022. Before we go deeper into what this actually means for the rest of the war, if this kind of clear, honest breakdown is what you come here for, make sure you are subscribed, because I break down moments exactly like this one as soon as they happen, without the noise, without the panic, and without the exaggeration you find everywhere else. At the center of Ukraine's entire deep strike campaign sits a homegrown weapon called the Lyut, a Ukrainian word that roughly translates to fierce or ruthless. It is a propeller-driven, one-way attack aircraft designed by the Antonov Design Bureau, with a reported range somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 kilometers, depending on the payload and configuration used. Its unit cost is roughly $200,000, which sounds like an enormous amount of money, until you compare it honestly to the cost of the assets it can actually threaten. Assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars sitting exposed on the ground. It is remarkably cheap for something capable of flying that far and causing that much strategic damage in a single mission. Ukraine is not producing these machines one at a time in some small hidden workshop anymore. One major manufacturer has stated publicly that the country is now turning out roughly 200 long-range strike drones every single day, with real room to scale that number even higher if resources and funding allow it. The result is a curve that Russia itself can measure, and has measured in its own official reporting. By Russia's own published figures, Ukrainian drone attacks jumped from around 6,000 recorded incidents in 2024 to more than 23,000 incidents in 2025. That is more than a fourfold increase in a single year, a growth curve that any military planner would find deeply alarming. Back in March 2026, one of Russia's most senior security officials, speaking publicly during an event in the Ural region, admitted something Moscow had spent years trying quietly to deny in public statements. No region of Russia, he said plainly, is now truly immune to Ukrainian drones. Nizhnekamsk is what that quiet admission looks like in practice, translated from a careful diplomatic sentence into black smoke rising over a refinery that most Russians assumed would never see this war up close. But the deeper story of August 10th is not really about any single refinery, no matter how important that refinery might be to the war economy. It is about the map itself, and about what that map is now quietly starting to tell us about the years ahead. Think carefully for a moment about the exact problem Russia is now facing, because it is genuinely difficult to solve with the tools currently available. On a single night, Ukrainian drones forced the country to respond across more than 15 regions simultaneously, stretching from the border zone all the way to the deep interior, thousands of kilometers apart. Now stretch that same relentless pressure across the largest country on the entire planet. Protect Moscow, the political heart of the country. Protect the strategic air bases scattered across multiple regions. Protect the refineries that keep the economy and the military running. Protect the ports that move goods in and out. Protect the military factories scattered across 11 separate time zones. Every single one of these locations is a potential target that Ukraine might eventually be able to reach, given enough time and enough range. Russia's air defense system is not something that can simply drag one missile battery from city to city every single time a drone shows up somewhere unexpected. Its network is layered, complicated, and built up gradually over many decades of military planning. Originally designed with a very different kind of threat in mind, one built around fast jets and ballistic missiles arriving from a predictable direction, not swarms of slow, cheap, propeller-driven aircraft arriving from a dozen directions at once. That mismatch between what the system was built to stop and what it is now being asked to stop, night after night, is part of what makes this moment so difficult for Russian commanders to manage cleanly. But the underlying problem does not simply disappear just because the system itself is complex and sophisticated. No country on Earth, no matter how large its territory or how advanced its equipment, can give every single strategic asset the exact same level of protection at the exact same moment in time. There are simply not enough interceptors, radars, and trained crews to cover everything, everywhere, all at once, forever. Russia's enormous size has always been considered one of its single greatest defensive advantages throughout its entire history, going back centuries. That strategic depth still matters today, and it still gives Russia meaningful room to disperse its forces, relocate valuable equipment, and absorb a certain amount of damage without the entire system collapsing overnight. But long-range drones are steadily eating away at the protection that distance alone used to reliably provide for so long. And here is the deeply uncomfortable part for military planners sitting in Moscow right now. The very same geography that gives Russia its enormous strategic depth also hands it an enormous amount of territory that now has to be actively defended, all at once, around the clock, night after night, without any real break. Every additional kilometer that Ukraine manages to add to its strike radius adds another entire set of sites that Russian planners have to lie awake worrying about. That is really what a night like August 10th is quietly designed to prove, whether or not that was even the explicit intention behind it. Not that one single refinery caught fire and produced dramatic footage for the news, but that the zone Russia can comfortably treat as being safely beyond Ukrainian reach keeps shrinking, month after month, strike after strike. Ukraine's home-built long-range drones have already pushed past 2,000 kilometers of range at some point this year, with some of the deepest and most ambitious strikes reportedly reaching all the way into Siberia. Against that kind of expanding reach, a city sitting 1,100 kilometers away from the nearest border is no longer a genuinely safe distance. It has simply become a matter of timing, resources, and priority for Ukrainian planners deciding what to hit next. There's also an economic layer to this story that rarely gets enough attention in the middle of all the dramatic footage and smoke-filled skylines. Refineries like the one in Nizhnekamsk do not just supply the military. They supply ordinary Russian drivers, ordinary Russian farms, and ordinary Russian factories that have nothing to do with the war at all. Every time one of these facilities goes offline, even temporarily, the ripple effects move outward in ways that are hard to hide from the public. Russia has already had to restrict fuel exports at different points since this war began, partly to protect domestic supply after repeated strikes chipped away at total refining capacity. Regional shortages of gasoline and diesel have appeared in parts of the country over the past year, long lines at certain filling stations, price spikes that state media tries hard not to talk about directly. None of that alone will end a war. But it slowly changes the mood at home in a country where the government has spent years insisting that ordinary daily life would remain completely untouched no matter how long the fighting continued elsewhere. That is part of why a strike this deep carries weight far beyond the smoke you see in the video clips online. It is not only a message aimed at military planners in uniform. It is a message aimed, whether intentionally or not, at everyday people standing in a fuel line who were told for years that this war would never actually reach them or touch their daily routine in any meaningful way. A quick reminder before we continue, because this next part matters. If you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding this conflict properly instead of just scrolling past another headline. So do this channel a favor, smash that like button right now. It takes 1 second, and it tells the algorithm to show this kind of grounded, honest analysis to more people who need it instead of louder, less accurate takes. There is another part of this story that does not fit neatly into a clean, triumphant narrative, and it deserves honesty rather than spin, no matter which side of this war you personally support or sympathize with. Those 13 deaths in Nizhnekamsk were completely real. Civilian areas of the city were struck alongside the industrial targets that night, not instead of them. Russian investigators say residential buildings were hit directly, and they have opened a criminal case formally describing the strike as an act of terrorism against civilians. Russia's own invasion, of course, has killed Ukrainian civilians on a scale that dwarfs this single night by an enormous margin, a fact that deserves to be stated clearly and without hesitation. Kiev argues, and has argued consistently for years, that energy infrastructure feeding directly into Russia's war machine represents a legitimate military target under the rules of war, regardless of where it happens to be located. But neither of those two separate facts erases what actually happened on the ground in Nizhnekamsk that particular morning. Civilians were killed in their homes. A child was among the dead. And as long-range strikes continue pushing deeper and deeper into both countries with each passing month, the physical distance separating the battlefield from the home front keeps shrinking steadily on both sides of this war for both nations involved. As these strikes continue to expand outward in every direction, the very idea of a fixed front line starts to lose its old, familiar meaning entirely. It stops behaving like a simple, stable line drawn across a map and starts behaving like something far more fluid and unpredictable, something that can reach almost anywhere on any given night, without warning, regardless of how far that place sits from the fighting everyone assumes is the real war. So let's be careful and precise about what August 10th actually does and does not tell us about where this war is truly heading. Russia claims it intercepted 456 drones that single night, a genuinely impressive defensive effort by any reasonable measure. Its overall air defense network has clearly not collapsed and remains functional across most of the country. One burning refinery, however significant and however costly, will not by itself decide the final outcome of this entire war. But that particular outcome was never really the test that Ukraine is quietly setting for itself with operations like this one. The real test is much simpler in concept, and in some important ways, far more patient and far more sustainable over time. Can Ukraine keep doing this, night after night, week after week, without meaningful pause for months or even years to come? 15 regions targeted in one single night. A refinery 1,100 kilometers away struck the very next week. Another target hit the night after that, arriving from a completely different direction than anyone expected. Ukraine does not need every single drone launch to actually get through Russian defenses. It only needs enough of them, often enough, spread widely enough, to keep forcing Moscow into an impossible, exhausting ongoing choice about exactly what to protect and what to reluctantly leave exposed. That is genuinely how the underlying arithmetic of Russian safety actually changes over time, quietly, month after month. Not through one spectacular headline-grabbing night that dominates the news cycle for a few days and then fades away, but through the slow, grinding accumulation of nights just like this one, repeated again and again, month after month, until the pattern itself eventually becomes the real message being sent, louder than any single explosion ever could be. For the towns and cities sitting near these refineries, places that spent years quietly believing distance alone would always protect them from a war happening somewhere far away, the reality now feels considerably darker and considerably closer than it did even a year ago. The war that residents there had only ever watched from a comfortable, safe distance, through a television screen or a quick phone update between meetings, has finally arrived directly above their own sky, in their own city, over their own homes. And somewhere out there tonight, in a hidden field or a quiet hangar, the next wave of drones may already be fueled, armed and waiting, heading eventually toward another city that still quietly believes it is far too safe, far too distant, and far too unimportant to ever worry about a war it thought belonged to someone else. If this video actually helped you understand what is truly happening in this war, instead of just reacting emotionally to one more scary headline, that is exactly why this channel exists in the first place. Hit subscribe, tap that notification bell so you genuinely never miss the next breakdown when it happens. And share this video with someone who deserves the full picture instead of just the panic and confusion everyone else is spreading online. This war is not being decided in one single dramatic night, no matter how large the numbers sound in the headlines. It is being decided quietly, patiently, in exactly nights like this one, again and again and again, until the map itself finally tells the truth that no press release ever will. Somewhere tonight, in a quiet field far from any camera, another Lu-T drone is probably being fueled and checked one final time before takeoff. Somewhere tonight, a radar operator in a region that has never seen this war up close is about to see a blip appear on a screen that was never supposed to show anything at all. And somewhere tonight, in a city whose name most of the world still cannot pronounce, someone is going to bed believing they are safe, the same way the people of Nizhnekamsk believed it, right up until the morning the sky finally proved them wrong.